What you're about to witness isn't just politics. It's a masterclass in dignity under fire. In a packed conference hall in Abuja, Nigeria's most powerful leader thought he could humiliate a young African president on live television. What happened next shocked the entire continent and sent ripples across the world. Ibrahim Traoré's response wasn't just words. It was a moment that redefined what leadership looks like in modern Africa. The cameras captured everything, and within hours, millions were watching a quiet revolution unfold in real time. This is the story of how one man's arrogance met another man's unshakable truth, and why the world couldn't stop talking about what happened next. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the International Conference Center in Abuja, Nigeria. Today would be different, though nobody in that grand hall could have predicted just how different. The banners hanging from the ceiling proclaimed unity through prosperity, an African renaissance, but beneath those lofty words, old rivalries and new tensions simmered like water about to boil. President Tinubu of Nigeria stood at the center podium, adjusting his gold-trimmed agbada with practiced authority. At 67, he had ruled Nigeria for over 2 decades, weathering coups, economic crises, and international sanctions with the kind of political cunning that made him both feared and respected across West Africa. His laugh was legendary, loud, theatrical, and often deployed as a weapon against those who dared challenge his vision of continental leadership. The hall buzzed with the controlled chaos of international diplomacy. Delegates from 23 African nations filled the ornate chairs, their conversations creating a multilingual symphony of French, English, Arabic, and dozens of local languages. Television crews from CNN International, BBC Africa, France 24, and Al Jazeera positioned their cameras for optimal coverage, while social media teams prepared to live stream every moment to audiences hungry for African political drama. Then Ibrahim Traoré walked in. At 34, the president of Burkina Faso cut a striking figure against the backdrop of gray-haired statesmen and career politicians. No elaborate entourage followed him, just 2 modest security officers who maintained a respectful distance. His simple brown suit was impeccably tailored but deliberately understated, a stark contrast to the designer outfits and traditional royal garments worn by his contemporaries. Most remarkably, he carried no notes, no briefcase, no tablets, just himself and whatever thoughts occupied his mind. The whispers started immediately. "Is that really him?" murmured the Ghanaian foreign minister to his aide. "He looks younger in person," observed a journalist from South Africa, frantically typing notes on her phone. "My son is older than this man," chuckled the elderly president of Chad, though his tone carried more curiosity than derision. Traoré seemed oblivious to the attention, or perhaps simply indifferent to it. He found his designated seat in the 3rd row, not among the front-row VIPs reserved for Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, and Kenya, but in what diplomatic protocol considered the emerging leaders section. If the placement bothered him, his expression revealed nothing. He sat with the posture of someone completely comfortable in his own skin, hands folded, eyes focused on the stage ahead. The program began with the usual pageantry. A children's choir sang the African Union anthem in Swahili, their voices echoing beautifully through the hall's acoustic design. Religious leaders offered prayers in multiple faiths, each blessing carefully timed to avoid offending any particular constituency. Economic ministers presented PowerPoint slides filled with optimistic projections about trade partnerships and infrastructure development. But everyone knew the real drama would begin when President Tinubu took the microphone for his keynote address. Distinguished colleagues, esteemed friends, fellow architects of our continent's destiny, Adetokunbo began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who had delivered thousands of speeches. We gather today not as separate nations, but as one African family, united in our pursuit of prosperity, stability, and progress. The opening lines were standard diplomatic fare, the kind of rhetoric that sounded profound, but committed to nothing specific. Delegates nodded politely, while checking their phones or reviewing their own speaking notes. The cameras dutifully recorded everything, though the producers knew these opening minutes would likely be edited down to brief sound bites. Adetokunbo warmed to his theme, his voice gaining strength and theatrical flair. He spoke of Nigeria's role as the giant of Africa, referencing the country's massive population, oil wealth, and regional influence. He praised older leaders for their wisdom born of experience and subtly dismissed what he termed impulsive governance by younger politicians. Leadership, he declared, pausing for effect, is not a hobby for the restless young. It is a sacred responsibility that requires decades of preparation, years of patient learning, and the kind of institutional memory that only comes with time. The first direct glance toward Traoré came during this section, though it appeared casual enough that television viewers might have missed it. But everyone in the hall understood the implication. Traoré's expression didn't change. He continued listening with the same focused attention he had maintained since arriving, occasionally taking a sip from the water glass beside his chair. As Adetokunbo moved into the economic portion of his speech, discussing Nigeria's ambitious plans for continental trade integration, his confidence grew visibly. The applause came at regular intervals, not enthusiastic, but respectful and sustained. Several delegates smiled and nodded, particularly those whose countries maintained strong economic ties with Nigeria. But then something shifted in Adetokunbo's demeanor. Perhaps it was the subtle restlessness he sensed in the audience, or maybe the knowledge that his speech was being live-streamed to millions of Africans who had grown increasingly skeptical of grand promises from their leaders. Whatever the trigger, he began to improvise, departing from his prepared remarks to venture into more dangerous territory. "You know, my friends," he said, his tone becoming more conversational, more personal. "I sometimes watch the news and see these young leaders making bold proclamations about revolution and change, and I think to myself," he paused, chuckling, "I think, where were you when we were building these institutions? Where were you when we were negotiating the difficult compromises that created the stability you now enjoy?" The laughter that followed was scattered and uncertain. Some delegates genuinely found the comment amusing, while others sensed the shift toward more controversial territory. Adetokunbo, encouraged by the response, pressed forward. "Leadership is not a social media campaign, my young colleagues. It is not about viral videos or revolutionary slogans. It requires the patience to work within systems, the wisdom to understand complexity, and yes," another pause, another practiced smile, "the maturity that comes only with age and experience." This time, the camera operators instinctively adjusted their angles to capture both Adetokunbo at the podium and Traoré in the audience. The split-screen potential was too good to ignore, and producers in newsrooms across the continent held their breath, sensing that something significant might be about to unfold. Traoré remained motionless. His hands stayed folded, his posture unchanged. If Adetokunbo's words affected him, he showed no visible reaction. But President Adetokunbo was just getting started. "I see some of you young presidents here today," he continued, his voice taking on a more pointed edge. "And I genuinely wonder, Do you understand the weight of the responsibilities you have inherited? Do you comprehend the delicate nature of the institutions you now control? The hall grew quieter. Conversations ceased. Even the most distracted delegates began paying attention, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about long after the summit ended. Adetokunbo turned slightly, making his target unmistakable. His eyes locked onto Ibrahim Traoré with theatrical precision. "Take our young friend from Burkina Faso," he said, his tone now dripping with condescension. "Captain Traoré, or should I say, President Traoré." The air quotes were subtle, but unmistakable, delivered with the kind of dismissive gesture that politicians perfect over decades of public speaking. The shift in the room's atmosphere was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones were lowered. Every person in that hall understood they were witnessing a direct public confrontation between two heads of state, broadcast live to millions of viewers. "Tell me, Captain," Adetokunbo continued, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent hall. "How does one prepare for presidential leadership? Is it through military coups? Through revolutionary manifestos? Or perhaps through Instagram posts about sovereignty and independence?" Laughter that followed was different now, nervous, uncomfortable, but still present. Some delegates seemed genuinely amused by what they perceived as political theater, while others recognized the serious diplomatic implications of such a public attack. Traoré's response was subtle but telling. For the first time since entering the hall, he shifted slightly in his chair, not defensively, but with the kind of physical adjustment that suggested a man preparing to respond. His eyes never left Adetokunbo, but his expression remained completely neutral. "I ask this question not to embarrass our young colleague," Adetokunbo said, though his tone suggested exactly the opposite intention. "But because the people of Africa deserve to understand what qualifies someone to lead a nation. Is it passion? Is it good intentions? Or is it the kind of deep, institutional knowledge that comes only through years of patient service within established systems?" He leaned into the microphone, his voice dropping to a more intimate register that somehow made his words even more cutting. "How long, I wonder, does Captain Traoré expect to remain in power before his people realize they need real leadership? Leadership that understands the complexity of governance, the necessity of compromise, the art of working within international frameworks rather than simply criticizing them from the outside." The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Camera operators zoomed in on Traoré's face, searching for any crack in his composure. Social media managers in newsrooms across the world prepared to push notifications about the developing story. In the press section, journalists frantically typed updates, knowing they were witnessing the kind of diplomatic drama that could define careers. But Ibrahim Traoré simply stood up. The movement was so calm, so deliberate, that it took several seconds for people to realize what was happening. There was no anger in his posture, no visible agitation. He simply rose from his chair with the same quiet authority he had displayed when entering the hall, straightened his jacket with a minimal gesture, and began walking toward the front of the hall. "I believe," he said, his voice carrying clearly, without amplification, "that President Adetokunbo has asked me a direct question. It would be disrespectful not to provide a direct answer." The hall erupted in whispers and shifted glances. This wasn't part of the program. There was no protocol for what was happening, yet no one moved to stop him, perhaps sensing that they were witnessing something that transcended normal diplomatic procedures. Adetokunbo caught off guard by Traoré's response, stepped back from the podium with what he probably intended as a magnanimous gesture. "Of course, my young colleague. Please, share your thoughts with us." But as Traoré approached the microphone, something in his bearing suggested that what was about to happen would be far more than a simple response to Adetokunbo's provocations. He reached the podium and adjusted the microphone height with a single efficient movement. Then he looked out at the assembled delegates, his gaze sweeping across the hall with the kind of measured confidence that comes from absolute certainty about what one is about to say. "Thank you, President Adetokunbo, for your questions," Traoré began, his voice clear and steady. "You ask about my qualifications for leadership. You question whether age and experience are prerequisites for understanding the needs of our people. These are fair questions, and they deserve honest answers." He paused, not for dramatic effect, but with the natural rhythm of someone organizing complex thoughts into coherent expression. "But before I answer your questions, I would like to ask one of my own." His eyes found Adetokunbo in the audience. "When you speak of experience, whose experience are we discussing? When you speak of institutional knowledge, whose institutions are we preserving? And when you speak of the complexity of governance, I wonder, complex for whom?" The shift in tone was subtle but unmistakable. Traoré wasn't defending himself. He was redirecting the entire conversation. "You suggest that leadership requires decades of preparation, years of patient learning within established systems. But I would argue that some systems are not worth preserving. Some institutions were never designed to serve our people in the first place. And some forms of experience, particularly the experience of accepting injustice as inevitable, may actually disqualify one from effective leadership in the 21st century." Murmurs began rippling through the audience. This wasn't the defensive response everyone had expected. Traoré was taking the offensive, and his target was expanding beyond Adetokunbo to encompass fundamental questions about African governance itself. "President Adetokunbo asks how long I expect to remain in power," Traoré continued, his voice gaining strength. "But I would ask a different question. How long should any leader remain in power if his people continue to suffer? How many decades of experience are required before a president notices that his citizens are dying from preventable diseases, fleeing their homeland in search of basic opportunities, or losing faith in the very concept of governance?" The hall was completely silent now. Even the camera crews had stopped their subtle movements, recognizing that they were recording something that would be analyzed and discussed for years to come. "You mock military leadership, President Adetokunbo. You suggest that soldiers cannot understand the complexity of civilian governance. But I would remind you that every liberation movement in African history was led by people who understood that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, existing systems must be completely dismantled before new ones can be built." Traoré's tone remained conversational, almost professorial, but his words carried the weight of absolute conviction. When Patrice Lumumba challenged colonial exploitation in the Congo, his critics said he was too young, too inexperienced, too radical to understand the complexity of international relations. When Thomas Sankara transformed Burkina Faso in the 1980s, established leaders across Africa criticized his methods as naive and unsustainable. When Nelson Mandela chose armed resistance against apartheid, moderate voices suggested he didn't understand the sophisticated nature of political negotiation. He paused, allowing the historical parallels to settle in the minds of his listeners. History has judged these men not by their age or their adherence to established protocols, but by their commitment to justice and their willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for the welfare of their people. Now Traoré turned his attention directly to the cameras, speaking not just to the delegates in the hall, but to the millions of Africans watching the live stream. President Adetokunbo asks about my qualifications. Let me be specific. I am qualified to lead because I have buried children killed by terrorism, while their government debated budget allocations. I am qualified because I have slept in villages. Without electricity while sitting, presidents lived in palaces with generators. I am qualified because I have listened to mothers explain why they would rather risk death crossing the Mediterranean than remain in their homeland. His voice intensified. Slightly, though he never raised it to the level of shouting. I am qualified because I understand that leadership is not about maintaining comfortable relationships with international partners who profit from African poverty. It is not about preserving systems that were designed to extract wealth from our continent. And it is certainly not about using age and experience as shields against accountability. The impact of these words was immediate and visible. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, clearly engaged by the directness of Traoré's challenge. In the press section, journalists were typing frantically, knowing they were witnessing the kind of political moment that defines careers and changes narratives. But Traoré wasn't finished. You speak of institutional knowledge, President Adetokunbo. But what institutions are we discussing? The World Bank, which has kept Africa in debt for decades. The International Monetary Fund, which demands austerity measures that primarily hurt our poorest citizens. The United Nations Security Council, which includes no permanent African members, despite our continent's size and population. He looked around the hall, making eye contact with delegates from various countries. Or perhaps we should discuss regional institutions, the Economic Community of West African States, which has done little to prevent the wars that have displaced millions of our people. The African Union, which issues beautiful statements about unity while member nations continue policies that divide us. The CFA Franc Zone, which essentially allows former colonial powers to control the monetary policy of sovereign African nations. The questions were rhetorical, but their implications were profound. Traoré was systematically challenging not just Adetokunbo's authority, but the entire framework of contemporary African governance. These are the institutions you ask me to respect, to work within, to preserve through patient compromise and diplomatic courtesy. But I would ask, what have these institutions accomplished for the average African citizen? What prosperity have they delivered? What stability have they created? What dignity have they restored? Now his tone shifted again, becoming more personal, more direct. President Adetokunbo, you govern Nigeria, a nation blessed with enormous oil wealth, a massive population, and incredible human resources. Under your leadership, Nigeria has become the poverty capital of the world, with more citizens living in extreme poverty than any other nation on earth. Your country imports more than 80% of its basic goods, despite having the agricultural potential to feed half of Africa. Young Nigerians risk their lives crossing the Sahara Desert and the Mediterranean Sea because they see no future in the land of their birth. The silence in the hall was now profound and uncomfortable. Traoré was delivering facts that everyone knew, but that were rarely spoken aloud in diplomatic settings. So when you ask about my qualifications, I would ask about yours. What qualifies? A leader who has overseen 2 decades of increasing poverty, growing insecurity, and declining international respect. What institutional knowledge justifies the continuation of policies that have failed so spectacularly? What experience is valuable if it consists primarily of learning how to maintain power while ignoring responsibility? Adetokunbo's face had changed dramatically during this section of Traoré's response. The confident smile had disappeared, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that suggested barely contained anger. He leaned forward in his chair, clearly preparing to respond, but Traoré continued speaking. But let me address your specific questions about military leadership, since you seem particularly concerned about my background as a soldier. Traoré's tone became more reflective, less confrontational. Yes, I am a military officer. I took power through a coup d'état. I did not win an election, did not inherit leadership through traditional succession, did not rise through the ranks of an established political party. By conventional standards, I am exactly the kind of leader that institutions like the African Union are supposed to discourage. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. But I would ask the delegates in this hall and the citizens watching this broadcast, what is the difference between a military coup that removes a corrupt civilian government and an election that allows that same government to remain in power indefinitely? What is the moral distinction between seizing power through force and maintaining power through manipulation, voter suppression, and constitutional amendments designed to eliminate term limits? The question struck at the heart of contemporary African politics, where many civilian governments had proven as authoritarian and corrupt as the military regimes they had replaced. In Burkina Faso, we held a coup not because we love power, but because the previous government had lost any connection to the people it claimed to serve. Citizens were dying from terrorist attacks, while their president focused on maintaining relationships with international partners who saw Burkina Faso primarily as a source of gold and uranium. Young people were unemployed while foreign companies extracted billions of dollars worth of natural resources with minimal benefit to local communities. Traoré's voice took on a more passionate quality, though he never lost control of his tone. We took power because someone had to take responsibility. Someone had to acknowledge that the existing system was not working, that patient compromise had failed, that diplomatic courtesy had become an excuse for accepting injustice. He looked directly at Adetokunbo again. You ask how long I expect to remain in power, but you ask the wrong question. The right question is, how long will it take to build institutions that actually serve our people? How long will it take to create an economy that benefits Africans rather than foreign investors? How long will it take to restore the dignity that our people deserve? Now Traoré's attention turned back to the broader audience, both in the hall and watching the broadcast. If it takes 5 years, I will govern for 5 years. If it takes 10 years, I will govern for 10 years. But unlike leaders who cling to power for decades while their countries decline, I am not interested in permanent rule. I am interested in permanent change. The applause that followed was scattered and uncertain, with some delegates clearly moved by Traoré's words while others remained skeptical or hostile. But the energy in the hall had shifted dramatically. This was no longer a routine diplomatic summit. It had become a fundamental debate about the future of African leadership. Traoré wasn't finished, however. President Adetokunbo speaks of complexity, of the need for sophisticated understanding of international relations. But I would argue that our problems are not as complex as our leaders pretend. The solutions are often quite simple. We simply lack the political will to implement them. He began ticking off points on his fingers, his manner becoming more direct and practical. End the CFA franc and create truly sovereign monetary policy. Negotiate resource extraction contracts that benefit African nations rather than foreign corporations. Invest in education and healthcare rather than military equipment purchased from former colonial powers. Create regional trade partnerships that prioritize African unity over European or American interests. With each point, his voice grew stronger, more confident. Stop borrowing money from international institutions that demand austerity measures as conditions for assistance. Stop attending summits where African leaders are treated as junior partners, begging for investment. Stop accepting the premise that African poverty is inevitable or that our underdevelopment is somehow natural. The hall was electric now. Some delegates were nodding in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable or angry. The press section was buzzing with activity as journalists recognized they were witnessing a speech that would dominate headlines across the continent. These are not complex problems requiring decades of experience to understand. They are political problems requiring courage to address. And courage, President Adetokunbo, is not a function of age. Some of history's most courageous leaders were very young when they changed the world. Traoré moved away from the podium slightly, his body language becoming more relaxed even as his words grew more pointed. Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world before his 30th birthday. Joan of Arc liberated France when she was 19. Che Guevara was 28 when he helped lead the Cuban Revolution. Martin Luther King Jr. was 26 when he led the Montgomery bus boycott. Nelson Mandela was 26 when he co-founded the ANC Youth League. He smiled slightly, the first time his expression had changed since beginning his response. Thomas Sankara was 33 when he became president of Burkina Faso and began the most successful period of development and social progress in our nation's history. He was 39 when he was assassinated by forces that preferred the old system of exploitation and dependence. The reference to Sankara was particularly powerful, given his legendary status across Africa as a leader who had prioritized African independence and dignity over international approval. So when President Adetokunbo asks about my age, I am reminded that youth and inexperience are often code words for independence and refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. When established leaders criticize younger politicians for being too radical or too impatient, they are often defending systems that benefit them personally at the expense of the people they claim to serve. Now Traoré returned to the podium, gripping its edges with both hands as he prepared to deliver his conclusion. But let me be clear about something, because I want no misunderstanding about my intentions or my methods. I am not here to attack President Adetokunbo personally, nor to diminish the legitimate achievements of Nigeria or any other African nation. I am here to challenge ideas, to question assumptions, and to advocate for approaches that prioritize African dignity and independence. His tone became more conciliatory, though no less firm. Nigeria is our brother nation. Its success is Africa's success, and its struggles are Africa's struggles. President Adetokunbo has governed during difficult times, facing challenges that would test any leader. I do not question his patriotism or his desire to serve his people. The diplomatic courtesy in these words made his earlier criticisms even more powerful by contrast. But I do question whether the approaches that have failed for decades will suddenly succeed if we simply give them more time. I do question whether patience and compromise are always virtues, particularly when the cost of patience is measured in human lives and lost opportunities. Traoré looked around the hall once more, his gaze taking in delegates from across the continent. Africa is the youngest continent in the world. More than 60% of our population is under 25 years old. These young people are not interested in hearing about the complexity of international relations or the need for patient compromise with systems that have failed them. They want jobs, education, healthcare, security, and dignity. They want leaders who will fight for them, rather than make excuses about why change is impossible. His voice rose slightly, taking on an inspirational quality. These young Africans are not impressed by age or experience, if that experience consists primarily of learning how to accept failure. They are not interested in institutional knowledge, if those institutions have consistently failed to deliver basic services. They judge leaders not by their diplomatic relationships or their understanding of international protocol, but by their results. Now Traoré spoke directly to the cameras, addressing the millions of young Africans he knew were watching. To the young people of Africa who are watching this broadcast, you do not need permission to demand better leadership. You do not need to wait until you are older to recognize injustice or to work for change. You do not need to accept poverty, unemployment, or insecurity as inevitable features of African life. His words carried the weight of absolute conviction. Your energy, your impatience, your refusal to accept the status quo, these are not weaknesses to be overcome through age and experience. They are strengths to be channeled toward building the Africa that you deserve. The applause that followed was different from the polite diplomatic clapping that had characterized earlier portions of the summit. This was genuine, enthusiastic, and sustained. Even some of the older delegates joined in, clearly moved by the power and authenticity of Traoré's message. But he wasn't quite finished. President Adetokunbo asked how long I expected to remain in power before my people realize they need real leadership. Let me answer that question directly. Traoré's tone became quieter, more personal. I will remain in power exactly as long as my people believe I am serving their interests rather than my own. The moment they decide that I have become more interested in maintaining power than in delivering results, they should remove me, through elections, through protests, or if necessary, through the same kind of popular uprising that brought me to power in the first place. The boldness of this statement sent ripples of surprise through the hall. No sitting president volunteers to be removed from office, even hypothetically. Real leadership, President Adetokunbo, is not about maintaining power at any cost. It is about accepting responsibility for results. It is about being willing to be judged by the welfare of your people, rather than by the approval of international partners, or the stability of existing institutions. He stepped back from the podium, preparing to conclude. I came to this summit, hoping to discuss concrete strategies for African development and independence. I came prepared to listen, to learn, and to collaborate with leaders across our continent. I did not come expecting to defend my right to serve my people or to justify my commitment to African sovereignty. His tone carried a note of disappointment, but also of resignation. But if this is the conversation we need to have, if we need to debate whether age matters more than results, whether diplomatic experience matters more than popular support, whether maintaining existing systems matters more than serving existing people, then I am prepared to have that conversation. Traoré looked one final time at President Adetokunbo, who sat rigid in his chair, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. I hope, President Adetokunbo, that despite our disagreements today, we can work together in the interest of African progress and unity. I hope that our different approaches to leadership can complement, rather than conflict with each other. But I also hope that you will understand why some of us believe that business as usual is no longer acceptable. He stepped away from the podium, his posture relaxed but dignified. Thank you for your attention. And thank you, President Adetokunbo, for providing the opportunity to share these thoughts. The hall erupted. Some delegates applauded enthusiastically, while others sat in stunned silence. The press section was a frenzy of activity as journalists called their editors, knowing they had just witnessed one of the most dramatic political moments in recent African history. President Adetokunbo remained seated for several long seconds, clearly struggling to process what had just happened. When he finally stood to return to the podium, his movement was stiff, uncertain. The confident politician who had dominated the earlier portions of the summit had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely shaken. "Well," Adetokunbo said, forcing a smile that fooled no one, "our young colleague certainly has passion. And passion, as we all know, can be valuable in politics." But his response felt hollow, defensive. The energy in the room had shifted completely. Traoré had transformed what was supposed to be his moment of humiliation into something entirely different. A manifesto, a challenge, a vision for a different kind of African leadership. As the summit continued, something had fundamentally changed. Delegates who had barely acknowledged Traoré's presence before were now approaching him during breaks, shaking his hand, engaging in intense conversations. Younger staff members from various delegations were taking selfies with him, while older diplomats found reasons to introduce themselves and exchange contact information. Meanwhile, President Adetokunbo found himself increasingly isolated. The confident laughter that had greeted his earlier jokes was replaced by polite but distant courtesy. Several leaders who had been scheduled to meet with him privately during the summit breaks quietly rescheduled their appointments. The most telling moment came during the lunch recess. Traoré sat at a table surrounded by delegates from smaller African nations, engaged in animated discussions about resource sovereignty and monetary independence. At the opposite end of the dining hall, Adetokunbo sat with his usual allies, but their conversation was subdued, almost defensive. A journalist from BBC Africa, watching this social dynamic play out, would later write, "In the span of 20 minutes, Ibrahim Traoré had shifted the gravitational center of African political discourse." The summit continued for 2 more days, but everyone understood that the real story had already been written. But the full impact of Traoré's response wouldn't become clear until the video clips began circulating on social media. Within 2 hours of the summit's conclusion, edited versions of the exchange were trending on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram. The hashtag John Traoré Speaks became the top trending topic across Africa, with millions of shares, comments and reactions pouring in from across the continent and beyond. The response was overwhelming. Young Africans shared the clips with commentary like, "Finally, someone said what we've all been thinking," and "This is what real leadership looks like." University students organized viewing parties to watch the full exchange, discussing and analyzing every word. But the reaction wasn't limited to young people. Older Africans, many of them disappointed by decades of unfulfilled promises from their leaders, found themselves inspired by Traoré's directness and authenticity. Parents shared the video with their children, saying things like, "This is how you stand up for what you believe in." International media quickly picked up the story. CNN International ran a segment titled, "New Generation of African Leadership Challenges Old Guard." The BBC produced a documentary exploring the generational divide in African politics, using the Traoré-Adetokunbo exchange as its central example. Al Jazeera hosted debates about the future of African governance, with scholars and politicians from across the continent weighing in on the implications of what they began calling the Abuja moment. But perhaps the most significant response came from within Nigeria itself. Despite government attempts to downplay the incident, videos of the exchange spread rapidly across Nigerian social media. Young Nigerians in particular embraced Traoré's criticism of their own government, sharing statistics about poverty rates, unemployment, and emigration that supported his arguments. Nigerian government officials initially tried to dismiss the incident as a misunderstanding or an example of diplomatic inexperience on Traoré's part. But as the video continued to gain traction, their responses became more defensive and ultimately more revealing. President Traoré is a young man with limited understanding of the complexities of regional politics, said the Nigerian foreign minister in a hastily arranged press conference. His comments reflect the kind of simplistic thinking that leads to instability and conflict. But these defensive responses only amplified the original story, creating new rounds of social media discussion and analysis. One of the most powerful responses came from a group of Nigerian civil society organizations who released a joint statement saying, "President Traoré has articulated concerns that millions of Nigerians share but have rarely heard expressed by their own leaders. His questions about governance, accountability and results deserve serious answers, not dismissive responses." International observers noted that the exchange revealed deep tensions within African political discourse that had been building for years. The generation of leaders who had come to power in the post-independence period was being challenged by younger politicians who rejected many of the assumptions and compromises that had defined African governance for decades. This wasn't just a confrontation between two presidents, wrote a political analyst for Foreign Affairs magazine. It was a confrontation between two entirely different visions of what African leadership should look like in the 21st century. The long-term implications of the exchange would continue to unfold over the following months. Traoré's international profile rose dramatically, with invitations to speak at universities, policy institutes, and international conferences flooding in from around the world. More importantly, his approach began influencing other young African leaders who found themselves emboldened to speak more directly about continental challenges and solutions. President Adetokunbo, meanwhile, found his regional influence significantly diminished. Several West African leaders who had previously deferred to Nigerian leadership began asserting more independent positions on regional issues. Economic partnerships that Nigeria had taken for granted were suddenly subject to renegotiation, with smaller countries demanding more favorable terms. Perhaps most significantly, the exchange seemed to catalyze a broader conversation about African independence and sovereignty that extended far beyond the personalities involved. Young people across the continent began organizing around themes that Traoré had articulated: monetary sovereignty, resource control, and authentic self-determination. The story of what happened in that conference hall in Abuja became more than just political drama. It became a symbol of generational change, of the refusal to accept failure as inevitable, and of the power of speaking truth to power with courage and conviction. As one social media comment that went viral put it, President Traoré didn't just respond to an insult. He responded to decades of excuses, compromises, and acceptance of injustice. And millions of us heard him. In the end, President Adetokunbo's attempt to humiliate a younger colleague, Retrief Continue Edithad, achieved the exact opposite of his intention. Instead of diminishing Traoré's credibility, he had provided him with the perfect platform to articulate a vision that resonated with millions of Africans who had grown tired of excuses and empty promises. The weeks following the summit revealed the true extent of the shift that had occurred. Nigerian newspapers, despite government pressure, found themselves compelled to cover the story extensively as it continued to dominate social media discussions. Op-ed writers debated whether Traoré's criticisms were fair, but few could dispute the accuracy of the statistics he had cited about Nigerian poverty and emigration. More troubling for the Adetokunbo administration were the internal political repercussions. Opposition parties in Nigeria began incorporating elements of Traoré's critique into their own messaging, arguing that the exchange had exposed fundamental weaknesses in the government's approach to governance. Student organizations organized screenings of the video at universities across the country, leading to passionate debates about leadership, accountability, and the future of Nigerian democracy. The government's response became increasingly heavy-handed as officials realized they could not simply ignore or dismiss what had happened. Social media posts sharing the video were flagged for removal, though this only generated more attention and criticism. Several prominent Nigerian activists who praised Traoré's speech found themselves subjected to harassment and intimidation. But perhaps the most significant development came from within Nigeria's own political establishment. Younger politicians, many of whom had remained silent about their frustrations with the country's direction, began speaking more openly about the need for fundamental change. A group of senators and representatives from the ruling party released a carefully worded statement calling for honest dialogue about governance challenges and the need for fresh approaches to national development. The statement was diplomatic in its language, but its implications were clear. Traoré's critique had given voice to concerns that existed even within Nigeria's own political elite. Meanwhile, across Africa, the video continued to generate discussion and analysis that went far beyond the original confrontation. University professors incorporated the exchange into courses on African politics and international relations. Religious leaders referenced Traoré's comments in sermons about moral courage and speaking truth to power. Artists created works inspired by what they saw as a defining moment in contemporary African discourse. The response wasn't universally positive, of course. Established leaders across the continent understood that Traoré's approach represented a fundamental challenge to the diplomatic conventions that had governed African politics for decades. Several presidents privately criticized what they saw as his disrespectful and destabilizing rhetoric. This kind of grandstanding might play well on social media, said one West African leader in a private conversation that was later leaked to the press. But it doesn't help with the serious work of governance and regional cooperation. But even these criticisms seem to miss the point. Traoré's speech hadn't been grandstanding. It had been a systematic dismantling of the assumptions and excuses that had allowed African underdevelopment to persist, despite the continent's enormous resources and potential. The most powerful validation of Traoré's message came not from political circles, but from ordinary Africans who saw their own experiences reflected in his words. Market women in Lagos shared the video while discussing the economic hardships they faced daily. University students in Accra organized debate clubs to analyze the speech and its implications for their own futures. Farmers in rural Kenya gathered around phones and tablets to watch a leader who seemed to understand their struggles and frustrations. One particularly moving response came from a group of young Nigerians who had been planning to emigrate to Europe. In a video response that itself went viral, they explained how Traoré's speech had made them reconsider their decision to leave their homeland. "He made us realize that the problem isn't Africa," said one young engineer. "The problem is leadership that has accepted failure as normal. Maybe instead of running away, we should stay and fight for the kind of leadership he represents." The economic implications of the exchange also began to manifest in unexpected ways. Several international investors who had been considering partnerships with Nigerian companies quietly postponed their decisions, concerned about the political stability implications of the growing criticism of Adetokunbo's government. More significantly, other African countries began reassessing their relationships with Nigeria. The economic community of West African states, which Nigeria had traditionally dominated, found its meetings becoming more contentious as smaller countries asserted positions more aligned with Traoré's vision of African independence and sovereignty. The CFA-Franc debate, which Traoré had referenced in his speech, gained new momentum as Francophone African countries began seriously discussing monetary independence for the first time in decades. France, the former colonial power that controlled the CFA system, watched these developments with growing concern, understanding that the kind of thinking Traoré represented posed a direct threat to European economic interests in Africa. But the most lasting impact of the exchange may have been its effect on African youth. Across the continent, young people began organizing around themes that Traoré had articulated during his response. University students formed discussion groups focused on African sovereignty and development. Young professionals created social media campaigns highlighting the contradictions between Africa's natural wealth and its persistent poverty. Perhaps most importantly, young Africans began to see political leadership as something they could aspire to rather than something they should leave to older generations. Applications to political science programs at African universities increased dramatically in the months following the summit. Youth wings of political parties across the continent saw surges in membership from people inspired by Traoré's example. The transformation wasn't limited to Africa. In diaspora communities across Europe and North America, young Africans organized viewing parties and discussion sessions around the video. Many who had planned to build permanent lives abroad began reconsidering their relationship with their home countries, wondering if the kind of leadership Traoré represented might make return migration a viable option. International academic institutions took notice as well. Harvard's Kennedy School of Government invited Traoré to deliver a lecture on leadership in the era of global interconnection. Oxford University's African Studies Center organized a symposium on new paradigms in African governance. The Brookings Institution published a lengthy analysis of what researchers termed the Traoré Doctrine and its implications for African development. But perhaps the most telling indicator of the exchange's impact came from President Adetokunbo himself. In the months following the summit, his public appearances became less frequent and more carefully scripted. The confident, theatrical style that had characterized his political persona for decades was replaced by a more defensive approach that seemed to acknowledge the changed political landscape. When he did speak publicly, Adetokunbo often found himself addressing, directly or indirectly, the criticisms that Traoré had raised. Press conferences that were supposed to focus on economic development inevitably included questions about poverty statistics and emigration rates. International meetings that should have highlighted Nigeria's regional leadership instead became forums for defending his government's record. The psychological impact of the exchange became clear during a subsequent African Union summit, where Adetokunbo's interactions with other leaders seemed noticeably more subdued. The man who had once commanded rooms through force of personality now appeared uncertain, almost diminished. Meanwhile, Traoré's influence continued to expand. Young leaders across Africa began adopting similar rhetorical strategies, speaking more directly about continental challenges and rejecting diplomatic euphemisms that obscured hard truths. The phrase, "African solutions for African problems," took on new meaning as leaders began questioning international partnerships that seemed to benefit foreign interests more than African development. The mining sector, in particular, came under increased scrutiny as African countries began renegotiating contracts with multinational corporations. Several nations followed Burkina Faso's example in demanding greater local ownership and benefit sharing in resource extraction projects. Foreign aid relationships also began shifting as African leaders, emboldened by Traoré's critique, started questioning the conditions and assumptions underlying international assistance programs. The traditional model of aid dependency that had characterized African development for decades suddenly seemed less inevitable and more like a choice that could be reconsidered. These changes didn't happen overnight, and they weren't without controversy. International partners who had grown comfortable with existing power dynamics pushed back against what they saw as unrealistic demands and dangerous nationalism. Some Western governments and institutions began working to isolate leaders who embraced what they termed Traoré-style populism. But the momentum had shifted. Across Africa, the conversation had changed from whether reform was possible to how quickly it could be implemented. The exchange in Abuja had demonstrated that challenging established authority wasn't career suicide. It could actually enhance a leader's credibility and effectiveness. Perhaps the most profound change was in how ordinary Africans viewed their relationship with political power. For decades, many had accepted that governance was something done to them rather than for them. Traoré's response had modeled a different kind of relationship between leaders and citizens, one based on mutual respect, honest communication, and shared commitment to genuine progress. The video of the exchange continued to circulate, shared by new audiences who discovered it through word of mouth or social media algorithms. Each viewing seemed to generate fresh discussions about leadership, accountability, and the possibility of change. In schools across Africa, teachers began incorporating the exchange into civics lessons, using it as an example of how democratic discourse should function. Students analyzed Traoré's rhetorical techniques, his use of historical examples, and his ability to remain respectful while delivering devastating critiques. The lasting impact of that moment in Abuja wasn't just political, it was cultural and psychological. Traoré had demonstrated that African leaders could speak with authority and confidence on the global stage without seeking permission or validation from external powers. He had shown that intellectual sophistication and moral clarity could be more powerful than diplomatic experience and institutional connections. Most importantly, he had proven that age and established authority were no match for truth, spoken with conviction and courage. In a continent where gerontocracy had often stifled innovation and accountability, his example opened new possibilities for leadership that prioritized results over relationships and substance over style. The story that began with one man's attempt to humiliate another had become something much larger, a catalyst for rethinking fundamental assumptions about power, leadership, and the future of Africa itself. And as millions of Africans continued to share, discuss, and draw inspiration from those 20 minutes in Abuja, it became clear that some moments truly do change the trajectory of history. What had President Adetokunbo intended to accomplish when he decided to publicly challenge the young leader from Burkina Faso? Perhaps he thought he could diminish a potential rival, assert Nigeria's regional dominance, or simply demonstrate his own political sophistication to an international audience. Instead, he had unleashed something he couldn't control, a conversation about truth, accountability, and the kind of leadership Africa deserved in the 21st century. And in that conversation, his own limitations had been exposed far more thoroughly than anything he might have revealed about his intended target. The irony was complete. In attempting to humiliate Ibrahim Traoré, President Adetokunbo had instead provided him with the platform to inspire a continent.